Hi there, my name is Don Tipping and I'm here in the middle of November 2024, and this is the next installment in the Agrarian Renaissance podcast. Last time we explored the topic of photoperiodicity, and as you can see, as we build an arc of the various topics, what I'm trying to do is fill the reservoir of the basics around which agriculture and really all of agrarian civilization, which is basically synonymous with most civilizations in the world, is comprised of. So leaving off at photoperiodicity and just understanding the idea of the seasons and how plants that use sunlight have evolved differently in terms of their flowering period and their reproductive cycles, depending on whether they are living near the equator or in more mid-latitudes or closer to the poles where really no plants grow because of the extended periods of dark in the winter. So today what I want to get into is what seems like a really obvious thing, but every time I ponder it when I'm out walking in the sunshine or looking at plants in my garden or in wild nature on a hike, is the idea and the concept and the process of photosynthesis. And it may seem so just plain like the nose on your face that we overlook it. However, I think it's important to consider how this has informed how life on Earth evolved over time. And as we know now, the Earth is about 4.2 billion years old, and that's a fascinating topic. I'll leave a little link in the show notes that is a link to a Radiolab podcast that explores a chemist who determined by analyzing the radioactive breakdown isotope of plutonium that we know as lead, and he was one of the first people to study that to determine the age of the Earth. And he also determined that lead is toxic, and that was, I believe, in the 1950s. Really interesting, that we didn't know how old this planet we lived on. We had so little knowledge of these type of things until fairly recently. So we are living on a planet in a solar system that is about 4.5 billion years old, and our planet is about 4.2 billion years. And just to put this in context, we use these large numbers, especially in macroeconomics today. People throw out billions and trillions like they're these interchangeable concepts. But a way to picture this in your mind is a pallet, a shipping pallet that's about 3 feet by 3 feet of $100 bills, enough to make $1 million, would be one pallet about 3 feet high, so a cube of $100 bills. $1 billion would be 1,000 of those pallets. So $1 million you could easily have right in front of you in your room, and $100 bills. $1 billion would require a warehouse to have 1,000 of those pallets. $1 trillion would be 1,000 warehouses. So it's 100,000 pallets of $100 bills. Another way to look at this is 1 million seconds is about 34 days. 1 billion seconds is, I'm going to back up here. 1 million seconds is about 11 days. 1 billion seconds is 34 days. 1 trillion seconds is 18,000 years and some change. So when we think about timescales, geological timescales, I think it's really difficult for us to access this, but evolution is an iterative, recursive process of basically reproductive success. Whatever the most successful combination of genes and traits that leads to reproductive success is the version that will occur next. And my earlier naive understanding of evolution was that the next version is always just better. However, evolution doesn't take sides, and it's just the next version is whatever works. So very often we don't see the precursors or the evolutionary links that bridge from the previous version to the next version. That's why we don't see a whole range of hominoids between our ancient ancestors and modern humans and chimpanzees and gorillas and the like. So the Earth, back to the Earth, 4.2 billion years old. It was a very turbulent early climate for the Earth, as basically matter accreting into density through gravitational pull and rotation around our sun. However, life began fairly early in this early cosmic soup that was the early atmosphere, or lack thereof, on the Earth. And this is a whole other topic, but I'll just give it some passing attention right now, is that early micrometeorites, space dust basically, that could just bombard our planet because the lack of a atmosphere in those early millions of years or hundreds of billions of years of the Earth's existence, contained 71 amino acids. And as any student of rudimentary chemistry may recall, it only takes 20 amino acids to form proteins, to form lipids. So you can imagine the conditions on the early Earth, and micrometeorites are raining down constantly as space dust as we hurl through space at phenomenal speed. And there's a emergent theory about where life started. We're all told that life began in the oceans, but it seems more and more that that's not correct, because when you add things into water, they go into solution, and usually it's a dissipating force. So the likelihood of these micrometeorites and their associated amino acids wouldn't be accreting together. However, in a volcanic pool, of water, if you will, these would, be gathering. And then basically in a laboratory, scientists have been able to take amino acids and a large electrical source and water and create life. So a big electrical source in the early conditions on the Earth would be lightning. So chances are that life started in hydrothermal vents with these amino acids forming proteins, early proteins. And as we know, DNA, RNA are proteins. And there you go. And it just gets more and more complex. So at about 4 billion years ago is the first prokaryotes. So we're getting today is a bit of a very condensed version of the origin of vascular plants, the evolution from prokaryotes to what we have now on Earth. And sorry, I'm skipping over major phases and classes and phenomenon and all that kind of stuff, but all that information is available. What I want to do is encapsulate this to get us to photosynthesis and how we have higher forms of plants now. That's everything in your garden, basically, unless you grow mushrooms. So and what prokaryote means is from the Latin. Pro means before, carry, the root of that is nut. So it's before the nut had a shell. So it's prokaryotes are pre-nucleic organisms. So it's just single cellular, real simple. They just live in water and create sugars through fermentation. And there's not a lot of sentience or mobility. They're just a floating life in a soup. So it's like that for quite a while, 600 million years. And then the first evidence of oxygen in rocks that, they're not plants at this point, but the first evidence in the ocean of bacteria, and what we're talking about is, the bacteria we had before it was anaerobic or anoxygenogenic, like oxygen would be toxic to them as life. And so if you've ever made sauerkraut, that's why you want to keep a water seal on it to keep oxygen out, because the bacteria you're working with in lactic acid fermentation are anaerobic. So at 3.4 billion years ago, we had the first green and purple sulfur bacteria that were around alkaline hydrothermal vents where there was low wavelength light deep down in the ocean, where a volcanic vent is creating heat, and usually 8 hydrogen sulfide gas, H2S. So there's an electron exchange to create oxygen, and it's taking the oxygen atom from water. So these first organisms that were bacteria, basically, and what we're talking about is green and purple sulfur bacteria. These are the first things to do photosynthesis, to use light to facilitate a electron exchange between water and hydrogen sulfide gas to produce oxygen. So it was like that for a long time, like 1.5 billion years before we had eukaryotes. And so back to our definition of prokaryote from the Latin, eukaryote means after the nut had a shell. So now we have a nucleus. And there's conflicting theories about how this took place, but basically, to quote Bruce Lipton, who is considered one of the grandfathers of epigenetics, and he wrote an excellent book called Biology of Belief. I'll put a link in the show notes, that you can explore this topic more in depth. And this word is thrown around a lot, but basically life begins as a point. So we have, single cellular, no nucleus. And then you get a bunch of those living as a community, which becomes kind of a superorganism, a bunch of anaerobic bacteria floating together. And then all of a sudden, through those interactions and various acids and lightning and things occurring in a dynamic early Earth, perhaps some of these cells slipped inside another one and they became the organelles of multicellular life, eukaryotic life. And those organelles would include ribosomes, Golgi apparatus, the nucleus, and all manner of cellular biology. So, but we still didn't have any oxygen in the atmosphere until about 2.4 billion years ago. So it was right around at that same time as we shifted from prokaryotes to eukaryotes. So there was a lot of iteration in there of early bacteria playing around with how to survive. And what's interesting is that moment that there began to be oxygen in quantity in the Earth's atmosphere was the largest mass extinction on planet Earth, where 99% of life, all those early prokaryotic, well, not all, but many forms of life for which oxygen was toxic, perished, unless they're, hiding out in some anaerobic environment. And many of those persist today in your sauerkraut, your kimchi, or in your gut biome, which is a fascinating idea that we have the early organisms of the early Earth, these single cellular bacteria, in the digestive system of all the higher animals. So fascinating point to ponder. Go check out Zach Bush and terrain theory and all that kind of stuff. There's a rampant amount of information about gut biome theories and how that works. But we're talking about photosynthesis. So in that evolutionary period is where we had the first cyanobacteria. So at first, they were mostly doing this electron exchange with hydrogen sulfide gas that was being emitted out of these hydrothermal vents and water. But then as life began to be able to survive closer to the surface of the ocean, where you had a higher intensity of light, the plants that were better at accessing those wavelengths and infrared and ultraviolet ends of the spectrum, those organisms were able to flourish and reproduce. And the cyanobacteria, if we go back 2 billion years ago, they were the dominant form of oxygen-producing life on the planet. And they probably flourished as giant floating rafts of bacteria and early protista, that nowadays a ancestor of those early protists would be marine algae that you or I may call seaweed. So there's still, so we're back at 2 billion years ago, so about halfway through the Earth's evolution until now. It's kind of like that for a long time, really simple. So if you were an alien visiting the Earth 1 billion years ago, or even 700 million years ago, fly over, you're like, well, a lot of pretty mountains, rocks, glaciers, water, oceans, lakes, but no plants, no green. There was no green on the Earth. We're not even at moss yet. We're not at lichens. It's just rock, ice, and water. That's what's going on Earth. And invisible bacteria. And I don't know, we've never seen pictures, there's no cameras around, maybe time machines will enable us to go back and did giant floating rafts of cyanobacteria look like green things? They were using chloroplasts, so perhaps it did give the water a green sheen, if you will, that would have looked more like an oil slick of green if I were to imagine it in my mind's eye, like what would, trillions of cyanobacteria look like? But individually you couldn't see them. Too small. The first land plants emerged about 475 million years ago. So these first land plants and, higher forms of plants on water, whether it's in lakes or ponds or rivers or the ocean, were probably more akin to the darlings of the permaculture community. One of them is my favorite plant, which is a zola. And a zola is a nitrogen-fixing water fern that is real small. It's like 1 millimeter to 3 millimeters across and reproduces pretty quickly, but it fixes nitrogen and is very high in protein, and it floats on the water. There's another one called duckweed, lemna. That one doesn't fix nitrogen, but again, it's a fast-growing, it's like early plant. They clearly have vascular structures, more complex, reproductive. So then we kind of fast forward, from 475 million years through the early forms of life on land, and we didn't jump right to lush jungles, despite what Steven Spielberg may want to have you believe by looking at Jurassic Park and that kind of thing. It was more probably like the precursors to mosses, ferns, cycads, horsetails, this type of thing. And we weren't even at flowering plants really yet. Those early, if you know your ferns or your horsetails or mosses and the bryophytes, which is lichens, which is an algae and at least one species of fungi that are working in a symbiotic relationship, it was more like this green sheen, so maybe if you were an early alien, doing a visual flyby of Earth 300 million years ago, it was still pretty simple. And recently in Mexico, scientists, through our DNA analysis, just keeps getting better and better. So our version of the early forms of plant life on Earth keeps evolving. Determined that what they thought were fossilized trees were actually fossilized mushrooms, kind of like a stinkhorn, not like with a cap, but just a big, tall thing that were 10 meters tall. And they're falling over at this point because we're looking at it now. They're fossilized, but they were from about 300 million years ago. So 10 meters was the tallest living thing, which was a mushroom, which is crazy. But when you think about it, horsetails and ferns and cycads, they produce spores, not pollen. So we like to put the various classes of life in, the kingdoms of life, or I like to say kindoms, because why would we ascribe gender to all these things that had both genders or, combinations thereof? And so as a refresher, the early, kingdoms of nature were the plantae, fungi, animae, protistae, and monerae. So the monera were all the bacteria and viruses and spirochetes and all that kind of stuff. So, somewhere in there between 200 to 300 million years ago is when we started to get, something that is a little more like your Jurassic Park version of life on Earth. And at that time, amazingly, the oxygen content of the early atmosphere was, I think, about 30%. Nowadays, it's about half that, or even less, which is fascinating. So, had so much oxygen, they're now believing that's what was one contributing factor, in addition to basically a subtropical climate over the entire planet, that contributed to the large size of early dinosaurs and the associated plants that made up their diet if they were herbivores. So there's the broad brushstrokes. Now to get into the nitty-gritty of photosynthesis. So plants basically nowadays and back then have stomata on their leaf surface, or needles or scales, or however you want to describe it. It takes the form of many things. And these stomata open up, and then they can receive carbon dioxide. They're basically consuming carbon dioxide. And then they take it into their structures, and they chloroplast in the leaves. There's the more purple-red end of the spectrum of plants, if you have like a red lettuce or those purple leaf plums, are using xanthophyll instead of chlorophyll. It's just a different pathway life took to access light, basically. So the plants are taking in light and carbon dioxide in through the stomata, but if there's a strong wind or snow or rain, these stomata close because otherwise the plant would dry out and desiccate really fast. So it's like a mouth, if you will, and you can see pictures from microscopes of what this might look like on various plant leaf tissues. So they take this in, and they're mixing it with water that it's taking up from its roots. And there is a certain amount of water I think the plant can take in through its stomata, and you look at like the redwood forest, but whether that it's just accreting on the tissues and falling to the earth or actually going in, I'm not totally certain. There's probably a combination of both. So it's taking in minerals and water and nutrients, basically nitrogen, the macro molecules and elements from the soil, the minerals, up through its vascular system. If it's a tree, the xylem and the phloem, but each plant has its own way that it's vascular. That's what when we think about the vascular system in a human, it's like our circular system. So plants have this too. So you got light and carbon dioxide going in, and then minerals and water, and then these are combining for the plant to basically form carbohydrates, sugars that feed the growth of the plant, and then its waste product, miraculously, is oxygen. And obviously carbon as the plant sheds leaves, flower petals, cones, and eventually its own whole structure, its life form, dies, and it goes back to become carbon and all the minerals back into the soil. So really incredible when you contemplate it, especially when you realize that we're part of that through our respiratory system. We're breathing in oxygen and the other gases in the atmosphere, which is predominantly nitrogen, hydrogen, I believe some argon and helium as well. And then we are exhaling carbon dioxide, as are all the other animals, and then the plants are consuming that. So it's this reciprocal symbiotic relationship. And obviously decomposing life, whether it's fungal, plants, animals, is also producing carbon dioxide and methane and other gases. So it's not just a binary between plants and animals. There's a multiplicity of gases going on, and you can consider all the carbon sinks under the permafrost and that kind of stuff. But back to photosynthesis, so every time you take a breath, you're actually participating in the cycle, which is truly miraculous. And the plants are, in a way, relying on the carbon dioxide producers to do this process. And carbon dioxide really makes up a very small percentage of the gases in our atmosphere. And most people are becoming more aware of this as we talk about parts per million. And it's really small amounts, like when we talk about the early atmosphere, when the dinosaurs were alive, having 30% oxygen in it. Carbon dioxide never even gets anywhere close to even being 1%. I think the air we breathe now is 78% nitrogen. So, and then the next fraction would be oxygen. So, back to photosynthesis, when you look at a tree, and I'll kind of close with this, and maybe you can form a mental picture with me. And the tree is basically a superstructure of carbon. That's an element. Carbon is an atom, and a tree or a woody plant forms its scaffolding, its superstructure, and then it's clothed in water and minerals through the xylem and phloem, and the bark, basically is the xylem is the transport mechanism going one way, and the phloem is the transport mechanism going the other way, and these cells only live for a little while, and then they die, and then one becomes the trunk of the tree, and the other becomes the bark. So when you look at an old Douglas fir tree or a redwood, you're looking at that accumulated, old tissue. Same with the trunk. And each of those is predominantly carbon, with some minerals, obviously. So, and then the branches and fine twigs is also carbon, and it's using the xylem and phloem for water transport, along with the minerals that are being transported to feed the rest of the tree. And likewise, the canopy is taking in that light. So the plant is sheathed, and basically water and light are the primary forces going on. And then carbon, it's basically taking, from the sun, it's turning light through the process of photosynthesis, taking in carbon dioxide and then giving off oxygen. So it's just using the oxygen as the fuel, if you will. You can think of a fire, and without oxygen, the fire goes out. So the plant needs some level of warmth, like in really, really cold places, the top of mountains and glaciers and the poles, there's no plants. So there's this fire from the sun, with all the light's coming from the sun, which is pretty fascinating. No matter how bright the moon is, I don't think plants grow from reflected sunlight from the moon. And then it's giving off this oxygen that's feeding other forms of life. And then its own body, its tissues, all the leaves, the needles, the seeds, the fruits are feeding all the other life. And that picture to me is just so miraculous. And I remember one of my early mentors in permaculture, Tom Ward, Tommy Hazel, described this picture that if you take, let's say, a Douglas fir tree or a pine tree, and let's say you're trying to create a pole for a building or fence post or something, and you cut the tree down, you strip off the bark, you cut off all the branches, and you leave that in the forest to compost, and you take out just the trunk, you're really not removing anything from the soil, because that's all just the stored carbon in the trunk. But all the minerals in terms of nutrient cycling are in the leaves, needles, the bark, twigs, and the fine tissues that either compost through fungal process or burn through the natural process, natural cycling of fire ecology. So as you go about your day and you're looking at plants, and I want you to just take that mental picture and the appreciation for the miracle of photosynthesis that you're participating in. And we're now finding, and I'll try and find information about this and put a link in the show notes, but I read recently that our fascia, that's a layer of tissue under our skin that kind of connects our muscles and organs, actually takes light in as well, and we feed off this light. And Dr. Andrew Huberman of the Huberman Lab podcast fame, who's an ophthalmologist at Stanford, talks about research that light goes in our eyes. So, obviously you don't want to stare at the sun because you can do damage to your retina. However, the ambient light that you get through your eyes is actually a very important element of our metabolic health and setting our circadian rhythms and many other metabolic processes. So ain't life a miracle? So our next episode, we'll pick up where we left off. Hopefully you found this interesting. And as a reminder, we have the video version, and we also have an audio version that's always available in a link in the show notes on our YouTube page. And for those of you that are interested, I'll just make mention that part of the reason creating this podcast is basically filling up the volumes of what make the agrarian renaissance. What are the primary texts, the bodies of knowledge, the gnosis, the accumulated wisdom that one needs to understand how do we reboot civilization as empowered, participatory members of the circle of creation through our role of stewardship of this beautiful Mother Earth. So this will become ebooks, other longer form books, and online courses. So stay tuned for that. We'll be working this winter on bringing that to its genesis point. Obviously, there's a lot of steps there. So thank you for your attention, and all blessings to you. Peace.